It's honestly hard to believe that one person could have enough charisma, or riz, as the kids are saying now. It's hard to believe that one person could have enough riz and power to manipulate an entire group of people into doing what they say, no matter the cost. On May 16, 1947, Roch Thériault was born in Quebec, Canada. For the first 2 years of his childhood, Roch was more or less a normal kid, although he was thought to have above-average intelligence. And it was this intelligence which led a preteen Roch into a deep fascination with the Bible, in particular the Old Testament, which he became devoted to studying. In the 7th grade, Roch dropped out of school, and studying the Bible became his obsession. He held a firm belief that the world was currently stricken with a war between the forces of good and evil, which would eventually lead to the end of days. At first, Roch identified as a Catholic, but quickly converted to Seventh-day Adventist Church, which was more in line with his own beliefs. Seventh-day Adventists believed that there will be a second coming of Jesus Christ, resulting in the righteous people being resurrected from the dead into a better world. In short, it was everything that Roch wanted. By the 1970s, Roch was no longer content to worship like everybody else. He wanted to create a miniature society full of righteous people. But more than that, he wanted a consistent audience who would listen to his preaching and applaud his speeches. Roch was persuasive, and by the mid-1970s, he had a small group of followers who agreed to leave their lives behind and live in commune in Sainte-Marie, Quebec. From the day Roch's religious commune began in 1977, it had all the key characteristics of a cult. His followers were banned from reaching out to their families, and they became isolated from the Seventh-day Adventist Church that they had all once been loyal members of. Roch told his followers that he had received a warning from God, telling them that the world would end in early 1979. Spoiler alert, didn't happen. As that day approached, though, Roch became more and more paranoid and unstable. He decided to relocate the cult to a remote area of the mountainside, which he named Eternal Mountain. While the members of the cult slaved away to build their new home on Eternal Mountain, Roch simply sat back and watched them work. They had to wear identical tunics to symbolize that all members of the cult were equal, but of course, Roch made himself exempt from this rule. From a distance, he noted that his followers looked like tiny ants, working to build an anthill. And this is how the now notorious nickname for the commune was created. From then on, they were referred to as the Anthill Kids. February 1979, the month when Roch had assured everybody that the world would come to an end, it came and went. The world continued to turn. After spending so long working and fearing the end of days, some members of the Anthill Kids began to question whether Roch had received a warning from God at all. Roch's response was that he had a miscalculation due to the fact that time didn't work the same way on Earth as it did in God's domain. So for the time being, the Anthill Kids were reassured. Roch now had a new focus, as well as making sure all of the Anthill Kids remained devoted to him. He needed to make their community larger and more powerful. In his opinion, the simplest way to do this wasn't to recruit more followers from the outside world. No, it was to personally impregnate as many of the female cult members as possible. Roch performed this task with gusto, marrying all eligible women in the Anthill Kids and fathering more than 20 children by different mothers. By the time the early 1980s came around, the population of the Anthill Kids was now at more than 40. They relocated again, this time to Central Ontario. And once again, Roch continued to follow the typical pattern familiar to anyone that's researched the formation and escalation of cult leaders. His initial charisma and kindness began to fade and turned into a cruel, totalitarian attitude. He banned the Anthill Kids from having conversations with each other. He was the only person in the cult allowed to have sexual intercourse without permission, telling his followers that God would inform him if they had misbehaved or been disloyal. He set about punishing people who he believed had sinned. Like the rest of Roch's behavior, his punishments followed a continued pattern of escalation. If anyone told him that they wanted to leave the Anthill Kids, or even if he just suspected they were straying, he would beat them, hang them from the ceiling, defecate on their bodies, or spend hours painstakingly plucking every single hair from their body. It just depended on his mood at the time. Before long, he was causing permanent, severe bodily harm, and he wasn't just inflicting punishments himself, but he was also forcing other cult members to punish victims for him, or making the victims physically harm themselves while he watched. Roch's followers were ordered to shoot each other in the arm, break their own legs, eat human feces, and cut off each other's toes. The children Roch had fathered were no longer safe. Even the youngest members of the cult were systematically sexually abused, nailed to trees, pelted with rocks, and held above open flames. Eliezer Levi, one of Roch's many wives, decided to protect her newborn child from Roch's abuse by leaving the baby outside to freeze to death, thinking that it was possibly a kinder fate than he would have met had he been allowed to live under Roch's rule. In the late 1980s, almost 20 of the children were removed from the cult by social workers. However, there was no further investigation into Roch or the safety of the adult members of his cult. Around this time, Roch started believing that he genuinely had holy powers, which would allow him to heal cult members by performing amateur surgeries. One of his followers, Solange Bollard, had an upset stomach in 1989. Roch decided to treat her complaint with anesthesia-free abdominal surgery. In the surgery, he punched her in the gut, gave her an enema with olive oil and syrup, and then tore out some of her intestines with his hands. You don't have to be a doctor to know that that didn't fix Solange's stomach pain, and she died the following day. Roch told his followers that he would resurrect her through the unusual method of drilling a hole into her skull and ejaculating into her brain. When Solange apparently had the audacity to remain dead, Roch finally gave up and buried her body. One of the Anthill kids was able to escape and alert the authorities about this. It was Eliezer, the same woman who had left her baby to freeze to death as an act of mercy. But now, she was in such poor physical condition that she was lucky to be alive herself. 8 of her teeth had been pulled out, her genitals had been burned with a welding torch, parts of her breast had been cut off, and Roch had amputated one of her arms with a cleaver after restraining her by stabbing her with a knife through her hand into a table. The fact that none of these injuries had caused her death is a testament to both luck and human determination. She just refused to die, and because of that, she was the one to take the Anthill kids down. Local authorities had always suspected that abuse was taking place in the cult, but because Roch had registered the community as a church, an investigation had not been able to legally take place. But with the escapee's testimony and the severe injuries that had been inflicted upon her, Roch Thériault was placed under arrest. He was given a 12-year sentence for assault, and consequently, most of the Anthill Kids members fled. However, Roch did still have a few loyal female supporters, with whom he was able to father 4 more children during his time in jail. That is, until investigators gathered more evidence and sentenced him to life in prison for Solange's murder. His application for parole was justifiably rejected, and he never reapplied. At the age of 63, Roch died in prison by being stabbed to death by his cellmate, Matthew MacDonald. After killing Roch, Matthew turned himself over to the guards immediately and handed them the murder weapon. He said, "Here's the knife. I've sliced him up." In Roch's last moments, after a life spent slicing up so many of his own followers, he got a taste of his own medicine. And no, he was not resurrected. That is 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, the host, and I really appreciate you listening. And I know what you're thinking. Joe, that story, could you make it more graphic? It was really graphic today, and unusually more graphic than the 10-minute murder stories usually are. And I can't apologize for it because without the details of the story, there's not a lot to tell. Normally, I will avoid a lot of the gory graphic stuff, talking about it in detail, and I'll mention some of it usually, but then other times, be a little bit vague because we're adults here, right? You know what I'm saying without me going into detail about what it is exactly. But stories like today, I feel like you need to know more of the information to really grasp exactly what was going on. Because on the outside looking in, you could just say, well, why don't they just leave this cult? Because they were scared to death. That's why they couldn't just leave. No matter what they did, no matter what they said, they were afraid of being murdered at any moment, being tortured at any moment, having their arms cut off at any moment, having their literal guts ripped out at any moment. So without the details, I don't think I could effectively portray exactly how dangerous this cult was for the people in the cult. All right, so if this is your first time listening to 10 Minute Murder, please subscribe now so that you can catch up on all the back episodes and never miss any of the new ones. Connect with me on social media, see the visuals that we're talking about here in the podcast. By the way, I will not be showing the visuals for this story in graphic detail. I'll show as many pictures as I can without being graphic, but you can find all that on the social media pages of 10 Minute Murder. If you like this episode, please leave a rating and review on Apple or any place that's possible. Your positive feedback is appreciated. Go to 10minutemurder.com for all things 10 Minute Murder. And if you're still listening at this point, I feel like I should tell you that since I moved the beginning part to the end, this part that we're enjoying together right now, I have no idea how to end this podcast. I could just say goodbye, but it sounds super plain and I don't know what to do. But today I will give you a piece of advice. Don't let the impulsive thoughts win. I have this bad habit when I go to Mexican restaurants where they put the plate down and they say, be careful, it's hot, but I have to touch it. I don't know why. They say it's hot. They tell me it's hot. They've got a pot holder in their hand when they put it down on my table in front of me and they tell me not to touch it. It's hot. Don't touch it. But I have to. And it's usually just like a bump. I'll just bump it a little bit. And every now and then they see me do it and they just look at me like, are you the stupidest human on the face of this earth? I just said don't touch it. So I guess this is advice to not just you, but to me also. Don't let the impulsive thoughts win. Have a good night.